Today we're going to begin with an examination of market structures. It's a very important concept in microeconomics, something that warrants a great deal of our attention, and will make up probably the majority of the AP exam that you'll take in May. Market structures basically refer to the interaction of individual firms selling the same goods, and how the setup of the market affects how they sell the goods, how they compete with one another, and ultimately how society benefits or does not benefit from a market structure. There are four market structures that you need to be aware of. There is monopoly, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and ultimately what we're talking about today, perfect competition. Perfect competition is seen as the ideal market structure by economists, and I'd like to examine why and have you be able to demonstrate and explain the benefits of perfect competition relative to the other market structures before we're all done. Perfect competition is a unique market structure, largely because of the existence of four conditions and or assumptions that we're going to make. The first of these is that under conditions of perfect competition, individual firms are selling homogeneous goods. That is, that these goods are identical to one another. They cannot be told apart. That is, a good from one firm cannot be told from a good from another good. That is, there is no product differentiation. So, for example, while a Whopper and a Big Mac are both hamburgers, we can clearly tell the difference between them. In the same way that we can tell the difference between a slice of pizza from Rosa's and a slice of pizza from Little Vincent's. Homogeneous means absolutely identical. The second condition that we want to be aware of is that within a perfectly competitive market structure, there are many, many producers. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of firms that are all selling these identical goods. And the reason why there are so many producers is because there are extremely low, if any, barriers to entry. And by that we mean there is nothing preventing a firm from joining into the marketplace and selling the goods that everybody else is selling. So, for example, if I wanted to sell those Whoppers that we referred to earlier, I can't. I would be sued by Burger King as a violation of their trademark. There's a legal barrier to entry. I need their permission to do that. Other barriers to entry might include patent, they might include copyright, and in some circumstances, a barrier to entry might actually be the economies of scale that exist within a certain industry. But under conditions of perfect competition, there simply are no barriers to entry, and that allows many, many people, therefore, to join. The last thing that we want to assume in a perfectly competitive market, or we'll assume to create a perfectly competitive market, is that there's perfect information. That is, there is no information asymmetry in the language of economics. And what that simply means is that people can't be tricked. You can't dupe anybody in the market about any of the information. All producers and all consumers are aware of all of the relevant information that exists within that marketplace, such that nobody has insight or additional information relative to anybody else. Finding examples of perfect competition in reality is actually a rather difficult task. Some people would actually argue that perfect competition doesn't exist in the real world, that the assumptions and conditions that we've outlined are too difficult to actually achieve. However, we do have some markets that approximate perfect competition and for all intents and purposes can be treated as such. Wheat, for example, is such a case. You can't tell one bushel of wheat from another bushel of wheat. You can't tell if it came from New York or if it came from Kansas. Wheat is wheat and is not differentiated. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of wheat farmers throughout the United States and throughout the world, and they're all selling that similar, not even a similar good, that identical good. Other agricultural products are like that as well. Corn, for instance, follows the same conditions. It doesn't have to be vegetation. You can imagine that livestock and fish also meet this criteria. You don't know which tuna fish your can of bumblebee tuna came from. A tuna fish is largely a tuna fish, and there is no differentiation between that. A cut of steak from one cow is identical to the same cut of steak in another cow. And so these types of products are referred to as commodities, that they will meet the conditions of perfect competition. They don't all have to be agricultural, though. We might also point out that gold is gold, no matter where you take it out of the earth. There are many, many places that produce gold, and gold is simply an element that has an identical structure. Lumber is something that might also exist. A plank of oak from one tree in one forest is identical to a plank of oak from a different tree in a different forest. And you simply cannot tell the difference between them. Not all naturally occurring items can be considered perfectly competitive markets, however, even if they are identical and can't be differentiated. For example, crude oil is largely the same no matter where it's produced on the face of the planet, but there simply aren't as many producers of oil, as evidenced by the oligopoly and cartel of OPEC, for it to be considered many, many producers, and therefore it doesn't meet the criteria of perfect competition. Outside of the natural world, we also might consider the best example of perfect competition to be the stock market. For example, if you would like to purchase a share of Google stock, you don't care who you're going to buy it from, because a share of stock in Google is identical. It carries the same rights and privileges as every other share of Google stock. So those are our best approximations of perfectly competitive markets in the real world, though it largely is a theoretical construct. So what are the implications then of a perfectly competitive market structure? The most important thing to consider is that the firms within a perfectly competitive market structure are considered to be price takers. That is, no individual firm has the ability to set its own price, that they must accept the market equilibrium as the price. They can choose to sell as many goods as they like at that price. However, they cannot alter that price. For example, if we were talking about bushels of corn, you can imagine that if a bushel of corn is being sold for $5 per bushel throughout the market, throughout the entire world, if I come along and try to sell you a bushel of corn for $5.25, I'm going to have a hard time making that sale. I can't make the claim that my corn is better than anybody else's corn, because of course all corn is identical, and you can't even be tricked into believing that, because remember, one of our other assumptions is perfect information and no information asymmetry. So if all corn is being sold at the same price, no individual can set a price any higher. So we can say that in perfectly competitive markets where the firms are price takers, the individual firms have zero price power, meaning that they have no ability whatsoever to establish a price beyond that established by the market. To this point, we've been talking about what is unique about perfectly competitive markets in the assumptions and conditions that we've outlined. But we also have to consider and be aware of the fact that perfectly competitive firms are exactly like firms in other market structures when it comes to the costs that they are going to face. There are going to be some different implications about revenue and profit that we need to be aware of. So just to talk about the costs, like all firms, perfectly competitive firms experience DMR, that is diminishing marginal returns, and that of course causes the upward sloping marginal cost curve that we're so familiar with. So we have our normal marginal cost curve, which of course demonstrates the law of diminishing marginal returns, starting at the minimum of the marginal cost curve. Because the marginal cost curve is below the average decreases until it hits the marginal cost curve and increases after, such that the minimum point of the average total cost and the average variable cost curve occur when each is respectively equal to marginal cost. A new concept that we want to be aware of is on the other side of the ledger. Instead of talking about costs, we want to talk about marginal revenue. So if marginal cost is the additional expense that the firm undergoes to create one more good, marginal revenue is the additional income that they're going to receive as a result. So marginal revenue can be expressed as the change in total revenue that a firm gets over the change in quantity of goods. So for example, if a firm sells one additional good at $5, their total revenue increases by $5, their quantity is changed by one good, so the marginal revenue from that particular good is $5. And in perfect competition, and for the time being, we're going to equate marginal revenue with price. Because if a firm sells one additional bushel of corn for $10, that additional revenue to the firm is going to be equal to that $10. I will warn, however, that marginal revenue does not always equal price, particularly when we're talking about the other market structures, monopoly, oligopoly, and monopolistic competition. The reason why we want to introduce this concept of marginal revenue at this point is because we want to discuss the profit maximizing rule. We assume, as rational decision makers, that all individuals want to maximize their profit. And so therefore, producers in all market structures will want to follow the rule that they should continue to produce such that their marginal cost equals their marginal revenue. And this kind of makes sense if you think about it, that if you were to produce at a point where the marginal cost exceeded the marginal revenue, that means that it would cost more to make the good than the firm is going to receive when they sell that good. And clearly, profits would decrease from what they possibly could have been. This profit maximizing rule shouldn't be too unfamiliar to us, however, as we'd previously discussed the concept of utility maximization for individuals. That is, that people should undergo any activity until the marginal benefit of that activity equals the marginal cost of that activity. It is important to realize that you should not stop when marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, because you're potentially losing out on additional units of that good where the marginal revenue would still be greater than the marginal cost, and you would be able to increase your profit by continuing to use those goods. Let's see if we can put all these pieces of information together into a meaningful model that we can graphically examine and analyze. The first thing that we want to start off with is an example of a perfectly competitive market. We can use our example of corn. And so this corn market is comprised of hundreds and hundreds of individual farmers that are all selling corn. And so therefore they have an upward sloping supply curve of corn in this market, that at higher prices farmers are willing to produce more corn. No surprise there. The market is also comprised of all of the consumers of corn that exist within a market or society that have a downward sloping demand curve. That is, that as price lowers, consumers are willing to buy more and more corn. And the existence of the supply and demand curve allow for the establishment of a market equilibrium at, let's say, a price of $4 and a quantity of 10,000 bushels of corn. This equilibrium is the only price at which there will neither be a shortage nor a surplus, so that all farmers are going to be selling at this $4. Remember, each individual farmer is a price taker, and so any attempt to sell at $4.01 even will result in consumers seeking out some other farmer because there are so many to have those goods supplied. But the individual farmer also needs to be represented here. And so this is where we're going to see an extension of what we've seen beyond our basic supply and demand graphs that we had seen in our last unit. Now we're going to look at individual firms within that market, and to do that we're going to use a side-by-side graph. On the left-hand side is the entire market, and on the right-hand side we're going to have an individual producer. Let's call this person Farmer Joe. Farmer Joe grows corn just like all of the other farmers in the market, but he's his own farmer. So we can examine his own individual corn. And because Farmer Joe has his farm, that is, one factor is in fixed supply, we can imagine that he's got a upward sloping marginal cost curve, not unlike all of the marginal cost curves that we've examined so far. And because of that upward sloping marginal cost curve, he's also got an average total cost curve that decreases until it hits the marginal cost curve and increases afterwards, and an average variable cost curve that decreases until it hits the marginal cost curve, increases after, and gets continually closer to the average total cost curve as average fixed costs become smaller and smaller as quantity increases. As a small business owner, Farmer Joe has some decisions to make. But as we've pointed out, one of the decisions that he doesn't have to make is the price to sell his corn at. The market equilibrium has established that all corn is going to be sold at $4 per bushel. That means that if Farmer Joe would like to sell corn in the market, he must accept this market equilibrium price. Any deviation from that will result in no customers for Farmer Joe's corn. So, what we can see is that he is going to be a price taker. We're going to take that equilibrium price and extend that over to Farmer Joe, label that as the price there, and just to point out that this is the same $4 for Farmer Joe as it was the $4 for the market. We had previously established that for perfect competition, price is equal to marginal revenue, so that we can remember that if Farmer Joe sells 10 bushels of corn at $4 a piece, his total revenue will be 4 times 10, price times quantity, of $40. But the marginal revenue from the 11th bushel of corn is only going to be $4, right? That 11 bushels times $4 is 44, and that is $4 greater than the revenue at 10 bushels. So the total revenue changed by 4, the total quantity changed by 1, so that the marginal revenue is equal to the price under conditions of perfect competition. So the decision that Joe has to make doesn't relate to what price to sell the good at, but rather how many of the goods to sell. And since we've established the marginal cost equals marginal revenue is the profit maximizing rule, Joe simply needs to produce the number of goods that results in that outcome. If $4 is the price, and the price is equal to the marginal revenue, then Joe simply wants to produce where the marginal cost of corn is equal to $4 and produce that quantity of goods. So, let's say that results in 50 bushels of corn. And it turns out that that is going to be the profit maximizing number of bushels for Joe to produce. And we can demonstrate that if he were to produce even one more good at 51 bushels, for that 51st bushel, the cost of producing that bushel of corn, that is the marginal cost, would be, let's say, $5, something greater than the marginal revenue of $4. It would cost Joe $5 to make the good. He'd only be able to sell it for an additional $4, meaning a loss of $1 on that good, which would result in a decrease in his overall profits. Now let's turn our attention to whether or not Joe is actually making a profit. You'll recall that if we want to talk about economic profit, profit is simply the result of taking your revenue, subtracting your total costs, and if you are left over with a positive number, that is equal to your profit. It's worth noting that we're talking about economic profit at this point. That is that the total costs include the implicit costs that exist. So our cost curves, our average total cost, and our marginal cost curves include the opportunity costs that could be derived from the next best opportunity that Farmer Joe has. So that any profit that we're able to demonstrate on this graph is going to be economic profit and not accounting profit. So if we know that profit is equal to revenue minus total cost, well, we want to be able to identify revenue and total cost on this graph. So we can simply focus on Farmer Joe at this point and ignore the rest of the corn market to take a look to see if we can find the revenue and total costs associated with Farmer Joe's production. So we know that revenue is equal to price times quantity. We furthermore know that Farmer Joe has a price of $4 per bushel and a quantity of 50 bushels. So that means that Farmer Joe's total revenue is $200. Now, we can demonstrate that numerically because we've got the numbers on our graph, but we can also demonstrate that geometrically because we have the price and the quantity. Because the price is $4 and the quantity is 50 units, if we multiply $4 times 50 units, we are multiplying the price times the quantity, and therefore the area of this red box is equal to the total revenue. Now that's going to be true whether or not we have numbers of $4.50 or variables such as P1 and Q1 to represent those positions on our graph. So the red box represents our total revenue. To figure out our profit, we need to be able to calculate our total costs. To do that, we're simply going to take a look at, again, our graph. We can see that the average total cost of producing 50 goods is here, so that the total cost can be derived of multiplying this average total cost times the same quantity of 50, resulting in this rectangle, this blue rectangle, representing our total costs. Once more, we can see that at 50 units, the goods we're going to produce, the average total cost is here, and we know that if we take the average total cost times quantity, that's going to equal our total cost. So the height of average total cost times the base of quantity results in the blue box of total cost. And immediately it becomes apparent here that our red revenue box is greater than our blue total cost box. And that means that our revenue exceeds our total costs, and we're left with a profit. And oftentimes we're asked to shade in that profit, or to color that profit, to demonstrate that. And so we would simply say that the profit can be established by looking at the difference between these two boxes, resulting in this green shaded area here. That this is the profit that Farmer Joe can expect by producing 50 units. And because he's used the rule of marginal cost equals marginal revenue, this green box of profit is the largest profit that Joe can expect. It's also worth noting that this profit is economic profit. That is, this is money earned in excess of what Joe could have done in his next best alternative, because those opportunity costs are already included in our economic cost curves on this graph.